The grand hearing chamber of the Senate Judiciary Committee fell into a tense hush as Governor Ron DeSantis leaned toward his microphone. A faint but unmistakably confident smile curved across his face. For nearly 15 minutes, he had methodically presented his case against Representative Jasmine Crockett's proposed federal voting rights bill, an argument built on the bedrock of state sovereignty and fortified with selective data that seemed to undermine her central premise. Representative Crockett, DeSantis began, his voice even and commanding, carrying easily across the vast room. Your legislation would shift control of elections away from the states, authority that the Constitution clearly reserves for them. Before we continue, can you identify even a single rule within your own state's election laws that prevents a lawful voter from casting their ballot? The tension snapped tight like a wire. Around the chamber, lawmakers exchanged glances, some fidgeting in their seats while journalists edged forward, their cameras trained and ready. The air was electric with anticipation. Jasmine Crockett, poised and composed, took her time. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her gaze held steady on the governor as she adjusted the microphone in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a calm precision that silenced every whisper in the room. One veteran Supreme Court reporter would later call what followed a masterclass in constitutional combat disguised as polite dialogue. "Governor," Crockett began smoothly, her tone steady but unyielding, "I have before me the transcript of your sworn testimony in Davis versus Florida last year, where, under oath, you acknowledged that certain provisions in your own state's election law could, in fact, prevent eligible citizens from voting. Would you like me to read your exact words into the record?" The confident grin that had lingered on DeSantis's face froze instantly. A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the gallery as the weight of her words sank in. Reporters lifted their pens. Staffers glanced toward one another. Everyone in the chamber could sense that a crucial line had just been crossed. What unfolded in that moment would ignite a national conversation about voting rights, constitutional authority, and the true limits of executive power. Before we unpack that extraordinary exchange, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more deep dives into the most riveting showdowns in American politics. Representative Jasmine Crockett had by now earned a reputation as one of the sharpest constitutional minds in Congress, a graduate of the University of Houston Law Center and a former civil rights attorney. She had spent years fighting voter suppression across the South. At just 42, she had already argued landmark cases before federal appeals courts. Known for her unflappable composure and meticulous preparation, her proposed Federal Voter Protection Act wasn't a spur-of-the-moment political move. It was the product of years of careful research and courtroom battles. Unlike previous voting rights legislation, Crockett's bill was surgically crafted to survive constitutional challenges. It sought to eliminate barriers that disproportionately affected marginalized communities while respecting legitimate state concerns about election integrity. "This isn't about politics," she had said when unveiling the bill. "It's about ensuring every eligible American can cast their vote freely, without unnecessary hurdles or hidden obstacles." Governor Ron DeSantis, on the other hand, stood as her ideological opposite, a fierce guardian of state control and a champion of strict election laws. A Harvard Law graduate and former Navy officer, DeSantis had built his reputation by positioning himself as a defender of election integrity. In Florida, he had introduced some of the nation's most stringent voting measures, insisting they were essential to prevent fraud, even though evidence of widespread fraud was virtually non-existent. Recently, he had spearheaded a national initiative dubbed Secure State Elections, a coalition of governors united in opposing what they saw as creeping federal interference in state-run elections. His testimony before the Judiciary Committee was more than policy. It was performance, a stage perfectly set for his national ambitions. The looming confrontation between Crockett and DeSantis symbolized a deeper constitutional struggle, the eternal question of how to balance state authority with the federal government's duty to protect fundamental rights. It was a conflict that had divided jurists, scholars, and voters for generations. Their rivalry had been simmering for months. When Crockett introduced her bill, DeSantis dismissed it outright as unconstitutional. She countered with precision, citing Supreme Court rulings that upheld Congress's power to regulate federal elections and enforce the Reconstruction Amendments. The tension escalated further after Davis versus Florida, where DeSantis's own testimony had raised uncomfortable contradictions, evidence Crockett now had at her fingertips. By the morning of the hearing, the stage was set for a showdown of rare intensity. Two seasoned lawyers, two distinct philosophies of governance, and one nation watching closely. At exactly 10 a.m., Chairman Whitehouse struck his gavel. The committee will come to order. Today's session examines Senate Bill 2771, the Federal Voter Protection Act, introduced by Representative Jasmine Crockett. Our first witness, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. The governor stepped forward, adjusting his notes with deliberate precision. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began. "I appear today to express grave concern over legislation that risks overturning the constitutional balance between state and federal authority in elections." For 15 uninterrupted minutes, DeSantis delivered a carefully rehearsed argument. He cited Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, invoking the founders' vision of federalism and warning against centralized power. The Constitution entrusts states with the responsibility of conducting elections, he said confidently. Each state serves as a laboratory of democracy, able to tailor procedures that fit its people. Imposing federal uniformity would erase that essential flexibility. He transitioned seamlessly into data charts projected behind him. Numbers, he claimed, proved that stricter election measures had not reduced voter participation in Florida. After strengthening election integrity, he declared, turnout actually increased across every demographic group. When he finished, several Republican senators nodded approvingly. The governor's testimony had been smooth, polished, and politically potent, a constitutional argument wrapped in calm authority. Then came the questioning. Chairman Whitehouse looked up. "Representative Crockett, you are recognized." Crockett leaned forward, her hands folded neatly before her. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." Her tone was steady, her confidence unshakable. She turned to face DeSantis directly. "Governor, thank you for appearing before the committee today." "Glad to be here, Representative," DeSantis replied. Still composed. "Governor," she began, her tone measured, "you've spoken passionately about state sovereignty and election management, but surely that sovereignty isn't without limit. Would you agree it must operate within the bounds of the Constitution?" "Of course," DeSantis said with an easy nod. "States must follow constitutional principles, including equal protection under the law. But the Constitution explicitly grants states the authority to administer elections, defining eligibility, setting procedures, and enforcing reasonable regulations. And who decides what counts as reasonable?" Crockett pressed. "Ultimately, the courts," DeSantis replied. "But our starting assumption must favor the autonomy of the states." Crockett nodded thoughtfully. "Let's examine that assumption. You testified that Florida's election integrity laws increased participation across all groups. Which specific measures are you referring to?" DeSantis brightened slightly. "Voter ID requirements, ballot harvesting restrictions, maintenance of accurate voter rolls, and chain of custody protections for ballots. And you're asserting that none of these measures create meaningful barriers for lawful voters?" "The data speaks for itself," DeSantis said confidently. "Turnout increased among every demographic, including minorities." "Governor," Crockett said evenly, "you're familiar with the difference between correlation and causation, yes?" DeSantis's smile faltered for just a second. "Of course. Basic statistics. So it's possible that turnout rose for reasons unrelated to your policies, like higher public engagement or voter outreach efforts? Multiple factors could play a role," DeSantis conceded. "But the key point is that our laws didn't suppress voting." Crockett nodded once. "Governor, you're a Harvard-educated lawyer. You understand that constitutional rights aren't subject to majority convenience. Even if 99% of citizens can exercise a right easily, denying it to the remaining 1% still violates equal protection, doesn't it?" A pause, then a reluctant nod. "That's correct." "Then let's be absolutely clear," Crockett said, her voice cool and sharp. "Under oath, Can you state that every single eligible voter in Florida can cast a ballot without encountering substantial obstacles under your election laws? DeSantis hesitated. He could feel the trap closing. A simple yes would contradict his sworn testimony. A no would destroy his defense. He took a breath. Our election system, he said carefully, is both secure and accessible. Any eligible voter who makes reasonable efforts can cast a ballot. Crockett's lips curved slightly. Reasonable efforts, she repeated, her tone slow and deliberate, as the entire chamber leaned in, knowing the true confrontation had only just begun. That's an interesting phrase. Let's examine what you consider reasonable. She opened a folder in front of her. Governor, I have here the transcript of your deposition from Davisville, Florida, taken on March 14th of last year. Are you familiar with this case? Dentis's expression shifted. A small tightening around his eyes that only seasoned observers would notice. Yes, I'm familiar with it. During that deposition, Crockett continued, you were asked about specific provisions in Florida's election laws and their potential effects. You were under oath at that time, correct? Yes. Just as I am today, DeSantis replied, his tone turning slightly defensive. On page 142 of this transcript, Crockett said, you were questioned about rural voters who live in counties without DMV offices where they can get status suit IDs. The attorney asked if you recognize that those voters face greater challenges obtaining the required identification. According to this transcript, you responded, and I quote, yes, certain voters may face greater challenges depending on their circumstances. That's an unfortunate reality of any regulatory system. Crockett looked up from the paper. Is that an accurate reflection of your testimony, Governor? Dentis hesitated. Context matters, Representative, he said. I was acknowledging that no system is flawless. But let me continue. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but firm. Governor, let's look at page 157 of your sworn testimony. She began. You were asked whether Florida's rule against giving water to voters in long lines could make elderly or disabled voters leave before casting their ballot. You answered that in extreme cases it could happen, though you said it would be rare. She turned a few pages. And on page 201, you admitted that cutting the number of ballot drop boxes might cause real problems for voters who work irregular hours or lack transportation. Governor, that's your own testimony under oath. You acknowledge that these laws could stop eligible voters from participating, but today you're saying there are new obstacles to voting. How do you explain that contradiction? The room went still. Lawmakers leaned forward in their seats. Reporters typed faster, sensing a turning point. Governor Dantis, usually composed and confident, hesitated before answering. Representative Crockett, he said carefully, you're confusing rare theoretical situations with actual voter suppression. Every election system has imperfections, but what matters is the overall outcome, and our data clearly shows participation went up. Crockett nodded thoughtfully. So you're admitting that your laws do create barriers even if you think they're minor. No system is flawless, Dantis said, trying to keep his composure. But these isolated cases don't justify the federal government taking over how states run elections. Crockett's tone sharpened slightly. This isn't about perfection, Governor. This is about American citizens being denied their right to vote. You recognize that reality when you testified under oath, but now when it's politically inconvenient, you deny it. She closed her folder slowly. So tell this committee which version should we believe, the one under oath or the one that fits your current talking points. A hint of red crept into Dantis's face. Representative, you're twisting my words. I've always said our laws aim for both access and security, even if there are rare cases that don't fit perfectly. Theoretical to whom, Governor? Crockett asked, her voice calm but cutting. To the disabled veteran who can't stand in line for hours, to the rural voter who must travel miles to get an ID, to the essential worker who can't reach the polls because you cut early voting hours. Are their rights just theoretical? Before Dantis could reply, Crockett continued, the Constitution doesn't protect only the voters who are convenient, Governor. It protects everyone, including those your laws make it hardest to vote. The hearing had clearly shifted. What started as a dry debate over constitutional theory had turned into a confrontation about real human impact. Exactly the ground Crockett had intended to take. She lifted another document. Governor, I hold here 7 sworn affidavit from Florida voters. Let's start with Mary Wilson, 78 years old from Gadsden County. She had to travel 67-mile round trip to get a valid ID after her old one was rejected under your new laws. She doesn't drive and had to pay someone $120, nearly a week's worth of groceries just to meet your new requirement. Tell me, Governor, is her right to vote just another edge case? DeSantis shifted uncomfortably. Individual stories don't prove systemic failure, he said. Our system offers accommodations. Crockett traced another affidavit. James Hernandez, a paramedic who works 12-hour shifts. He used to vote using a drop box near his job. After you cut the number of drop boxes and restricted their hours, he couldn't vote in the last election. This isn't an isolated story, Governor. It's a pattern. These are Americans being blocked from voting by policies you personally pushed. The atmosphere was tense now. Even some committee members who had been nodding with DeSantis earlier were silent. Representative, DeSantis said, his tone defensive, we still have a duty to protect election integrity. Crockett immediately countered. Let's talk about that integrity. She held up another document. This is from your own Florida Division of Elections. From 2000 to 2023, that's 23 years and over 50 million ballots, there were only 153 confirmed cases of voter fraud. That's less than 0.03%. Most of those weren't even deliberate fraud, but clerical mistakes. So, Governor, you've defended laws that stop eligible voters from participating to solve a problem that practically doesn't exist. DeSantis tried to regain control. Representative. Even a single fraudulent vote undermines confidence in the system. Crockett didn't hesitate. And a single citizen being denied their constitutional right undermines democracy itself. Governor, you can't protect democracy by denying it to the people. The committee room buzzed as Crockett's words landed. What began as a technical hearing had become a defining moment. Not about party or policy, but about the principle at the core of American democracy. Every citizen's right to vote. Excellent. I understand exactly what you need. You want this entire passage rewritten without losing length, avoiding reused phrasing, keeping it clear and easy to understand, and making it SEO friendly. So it reads naturally but is optimized for YouTube narration or article performance. Here's your fully rewritten originalized version. Same content, same depth, zero reused wording, simple language, and keyword-rich phrasing for maximum SEO value. Crockett didn't hesitate to respond. Governor, the difference is clear, she said firmly. Your own data and sworn statements show that your laws have stopped thousands of illegible voters from casting ballots, all to prevent a handful of potential fraudulent votes that you can't even quantify. She picked up the Davis case transcript again and continued on page 276 of your deposition. You were asked whether you could identify how many fraudulent votes these new laws actually prevented, and your answer under oath was no. We cannot provide specific numbers because such figures would be speculative. Crockett set the document down. So by your own admission, you can't prove that these laws stop fraud, but you can confirm they block eligible Americans from voting. Governor, how is that a reasonable or constitutional balance? For the first time during the hearing, DeSantis looked visibly unsettled. His usual calm confidence gave way to unease. Representative Hebegan, election integrity isn't only about counting proven fraud cases. It's also about maintaining public confidence in the fairness of elections. Voter confidence, Crockett repeated, leaning slightly forward. Interesting you mentioned that, Governor. She lifted another document. This is pulling data from Florida's Secretary of State. Before your so-called integrity laws took effect, 79% of voters said they trusted the election process. After your measures were implemented, that confidence fell to 71%. So your laws reduced public trust. They didn't strengthen it. A murmur rippled through the hearing room. Reporters typed rapidly, realizing the moment had shifted. What began as an opportunity for DeSantis to defend his constitutional philosophy was turning into a test of credibility. Chairman Whitehouse finally spoke. The representative's time has expired. Governor, you may give a brief response. DeSantis straightened slightly, trying to recover his footing. Public polling changes all the time. Hassayed. The real issue here is that the Constitution gives states, not Washington, the authority to manage elections. Crockett requested one more minute, and the chairman agreed. She turned back to DeSantis. Governor, this isn't a question of federal versus state power. She said, it's a question of the Constitution versus state laws that violate it. You've admitted under oath that your laws put up barriers for eligible voters. States do control their election systems, but that authority doesn't extend to denying constitutional rights. She paused, then spoke with deliberate clarity. The 15th Amendment forbids discrimination in voting based on race. The 19th protects women's right to vote. The 26th ensures every citizen over 18 can vote. And the 14th guarantees equal protection under the law. My bill doesn't take elections away from states. It simply ensures state laws obey the Constitution. Crockett fixed her gaze on DeSantis. Governor, you swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, not to a political theory about state sovereignty that lets you decide whose votes count. By your own testimony, your laws have prevented eligible Americans from voting. That's not constitutional governance, Governor. That's precisely what the Constitution forbids. The hearing room fell completely silent. DeSantis, usually sharp and quick to respond, looked momentarily speechless. Lawmakers exchanged glances, aware they had just witnessed a rare moment of substance. A debate stripped of political spin and grounded entirely in constitutional principle. By the end of the day, the exchange dominated headlines. News outlets from every political corner ran the story. The Washington Post summarized it best. Crockett uses DeSantis' own words to expose contradictions on voting rights. Their coverage noted that her approach stood out not for partisanship, but for precision, methodically using the governor's sworn statements to challenge his public claims. Even conservative commentators acknowledged her performance. The National Review ran a piece titled "A Lesson in Constitutional Preparation," crediting Crockett's calm, evidence-based questioning as a model for how congressional oversight should work, grounded in facts, not theatrics. For Governor DeSantis, the fallout was immediate. His aides first tried to dismiss the moment as political theater, but that narrative fell flat as millions viewed the full exchange online. The hearing's viral clips showed not a partisan clash, but a governor being held accountable by his own testimony. 3 days later, DeSantis appeared on a sympathetic cable network to address the controversy. "I continue to support Florida's election integrity laws," he said. "However, I also recognize that we must keep improving how these laws are implemented to ensure all eligible voters can participate." Representative Crockett made some points worth considering. Though I still disagree with federal involvement in this area, his words signaled a subtle shift, a rare moment of acknowledgement after a confrontation that had already become one of the most talked-about congressional exchanges of the year. The governor's unexpectedly moderate response caught many political analysts off guard. Experts who had expected a combative follow-up were surprised by his measured tone. A political scientist at the University of Virginia observed, "When someone as seasoned as Governor DeSantis takes a softer, more conciliatory approach, it signals recognition that the earlier exchange didn't unfold as intended. He's trying to minimize damage and reshape public perception." For Representative Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath brought a wave of national attention, not only to her proposed legislation, but also to her calm constitutional method of oversight. Law schools around the country reached out for permission to include footage of the hearing in their courses on constitutional law and congressional process. The American Bar Association invited her to headline its annual voting rights conference. In a surprising display of bipartisanship, 3 Republican senators privately approached Crockett to discuss possible revisions to her bill that could ease genuine state-level concerns while preserving strong constitutional protections. "Your focus stayed on the Constitution, not politics," one senator told her. "That makes real dialogue possible." Most importantly, the confrontation sparked a far-reaching public discussion about how constitutional rights interact with state control of election procedures. Editorial. Boards nationwide published opinion pieces exploring that balance between state authority and the federal duty to protect voting rights. One constitutional scholar writing for The Atlantic summarized it best. "We can't claim loyalty to the Constitution while defending laws that, by their author's own admission, restrict the rights the Constitution guarantees." 6 months later, the ripple effects were still visible. Florida's legislature passed modest but meaningful reforms addressing some of the barriers Crockett had exposed, including expanded ID options for older voters and longer drop-box hours. Though Governor DeSantis never directly linked these changes to the hearing, political observers widely interpreted them as quiet recognition of the weaknesses. Crockett had revealed the influence went beyond Florida. Several other states began adding accessibility impact assessments. When drafting new election laws to evaluate how changes might affect different groups of voters, election officials from both parties launched the Accessible Democracy Initiative, a coalition dedicated to removing barriers that disproportionately harm vulnerable communities. Meanwhile, Crockett's original Federal Voter Protection Act evolved through bipartisan collaboration. She incorporated several practical suggestions from both Republican and Democratic colleagues. The revised version kept the core constitutional safeguards intact while granting states more flexibility in how to implement them. This balanced approach drew support from moderate lawmakers on both sides, creating a realistic path toward passage that few believed possible before her. Confrontation with DeSantis for constitutional scholars. The Crockett-Dennis exchange became a landmark example of effective legislative oversight. A Soane Georgetown law professor explained, "What made it historic wasn't partisanship. It was discipline." Representative Crockett grounded every question in constitutional text and factual evidence, forcing a real reckoning between principles and consequences. 3 years later, when a major voting rights case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, several justices cited testimony first introduced during the Crockett-Dennis hearing. The majority opinion even quoted Crockett's words directly. "The Constitution doesn't protect only the rights of citizens who are easy to accommodate. It protects all Americans for ordinary Americans." The hearing offered rare clarity in an often confusing political landscape. "I wasn't sure what to believe about these voting laws before," said a retired teacher from Ohio. "But when I saw Representative Crockett calmly lay out real examples and use the governor's own words against him, it all made sense. This isn't about party politics. It's about whether every citizen's vote really counts." The experience left both figures changed. Governor DeSantis appeared more cautious and perhaps wiser in later discussions about constitutional limits. In future interviews, he avoided sweeping claims and acknowledged the need for continuous improvements to protect access. That humility, while less dramatic, earned him credibility among moderate voters. Representative Crockett, meanwhile, stayed consistent in her disciplined, evidence-driven approach. Even with her newfound prominence, she resisted pressure to chase headlines or adopt an aggressive tone. "My goal isn't to create viral clips," she said in an interview. "My job is to make sure our laws keep their constitutional promises to every American. That takes research, preparation, and principle, not personality." Ultimately, the true legacy of the Crockett-Dennis confrontation wasn't a partisan victory. It was a reminder that genuine oversight depends on exposing the gap between what leaders say and what their policies actually do. In an era dominated by political spectacle, their exchange stood out as a rare moment of serious fact-based constitutional debate that crossed party lines. If you found this analysis informative, remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more detailed coverage of today's most pressing constitutional and political issues. Share your thoughts below. How do you think the balance between state authority and constitutional protections should shape America's voting systems?